Fog lay upon the neck like breath upon a mirror, the air close and wet, the water black as old iron beneath the small hide boat. Willow leaves hung in curtains.
Reeds hissed.
Every so often a frog plopped into the channel with a sound like a coin into a well. 𝒔𝒊𝒒 Reed rode without speaking, her face drawn and hollow, the skin beneath her eyes smudged with sleeplessness. Bran lay propped among furs, watching the slow procession of ghost-pale trunks glide past on either side. The air tasted of peat and tannin and old, cold secrets. "Quiet water," Howland Reed said from the stern. He wore a coat of mottled leather and a sheaf of frog spears. His hair was streaked with swamp mist and his eyes were the color of the reeds. "Quiet minds. Keep them both, and nothing here will find you." "Hodder," murmured Hodder. His body hunched forward as if to make himself smaller beneath the reed's tangle. He pulled the hood farther down over his brow. The word was both prayer and name. Bran listened to the mud suck at the boat when 𝒔𝒊𝒒 shifted the oars. He listened to the endless, sighing whisper of the reeds. The world here felt close, as if the sky had crouched low to the water. He had dreamt of white roots and the taste of earth, of ravens clicking and a voice like wind in winter branches calling, "Come, come." He had dreamt of a cave and a throne of roots, of a man whose eyes were milky with age and whose voice smelled of sap. He had dreamt of a mark, a cold hand on his flesh he could not wash away. He had woken shaking and said no. The others had not argued. Jojen was gone, swallowed up by a fever so fast and fierce it felt like a theft. 𝒔𝒊𝒒 had not cried where Bran could see, but her breath had rasped like torn cloth, and for days she had not spoken except to name the plants she dug up to steep into bitter teas. Ben-Jen had found them afterward, gaunt and half-ghostly, and brought them south through the bitter winter woods like a shadow shepherd. When the wall had reared up from the earth like a frozen mountain, Ben-Jen had stood in the trees beneath its shadow and rested his hand, gloved and stiff and not quite warm, on Bran's shoulder. "You carry a name that should not be a blade," he'd said in a voice like frost breaking. "Keep it. Stay a boy. Let the trees be trees." And then he had ridden back into the white, and the white had closed after him. Now the reeds whispered. A dragonfly skittered low over the water. 𝒔𝒊𝒒 paused, bent, and touched the water with the blade of her hand. "Green and black," she said softly. "It's safe." "How do you know?" Bran asked. 𝒔𝒊𝒒 dipped her fingers into the channel and brought them up again, slick with peat. She rubbed them together. "You can taste iron and you can taste salt. The dead taste like neither. They taste like nothing. This tastes like the neck." Howland smiled faintly. "Listen to her and you may live long enough for your beard to go white, Brandon Stark." "Hodder," Hodder agreed. They drifted on, deeper into the maze. Once, in the night, they passed through a region where the leaves were red as rust and the trunks blotched with ghostly white. Rotten stands where the water lay still and black and the smell of decay wrapped around them like a damp cloak. Fireflies floated above the water, and when they struck the reeds they went out as if pinched between fingers. Howlands or never touched the bottom. After a time he pulled them past a skin of green duckweed into fresher flow, and the air changed. They slept in turns, under a lean-to of willows, and birds with yellow eyes watched them from branches that dipped low enough to touch Bran's hair. Greywater Watch rose from the mists without warning on the third day. Not a castle at all except where it wanted to be one. Its timber palisades greened with moss, its islands linked by causeways that came and went the way a man's breath comes and goes in winter. The halls had reeds for roofs and the rooftops grew more reeds. The doors were skin. The hearths burned peat, and the smoke smelled of old books and wet earth. Reed men and women moved through the compound like the grey water itself, and when they looked at Bran their eyes did not weigh him as a lord but as a boy with a thing upon him, scab or star or burden. They did not bow, but they made a little space around him as if what he carried leaked into the air. Howland's wife, Mara, was small and light-footed and had hair as straight as the spears in Howland's bundles. She fed them fish stew and frogs crisped in fat and a dark bread that stuck in Bran's teeth like glue. She looked at his legs and said nothing, as if his uselessness was as ordinary as the muck on the threshold. "When we go to the Isle," she told Howland at the hearth. "We will bring the boy. He has the smell." Bran swallowed. The Isle of Faces had been a shape in maps and in old stories, the place where first men and children made peace, where the trees wore eyes. "What will I be there?" he asked. The peat crackled. Sparks flew up like a swarm of winged ants and died on the damp air. "A priest? A singer? You will be yourself," Howland said. "If the trees seduce you from that, I will cut the roots with my own hand and pull you free, even if you curse me. I owed your father too much to let a tree swallow a Stark." Bran set his spoon down. His dreams pressed at the back of his eyes like cold thumbs. He could feel the thrum of sap through the keep's timbers, the slow pulse of something older than houses and men. "I am only a boy," he said, so quietly he barely heard himself. "Be one," said Mira, and there was a rawness in her tone that ended any thought of argument. Outside, fog coiled. Inside, the hearth coals burned low, and Bran slept without dreams for the first time in weeks. Far to the north of the neck, above the broken back of a cold world, Castle Black's courtyards were black with men and grief and treachery. Jon Snow bled into the snow, which did not drink his heat as greedily as it might have once. He heard the men who had called him brother mutter half apologies to their own guts as they ran. He saw the night, more crowded than it should be, gather over him like a tide. He died in bitterness and woke in astonishment. Melisandre's hands trembled when she shaved the hair from his face. One stripe, two, like a mother's weeping. �𝒊𝒔𝒊𝒒 stood with his back to the door as if he expected it to leap at them, and his shadow across the floor was long and the shadow of a younger man. Ghost lay with his great white head on his paws, red eyes open and unblinking. The room smelled of smoke and iron and lamb fat, and when Jon's breath came back to him, it was like climbing out of a lake in winter and discovering that apart from the ice in your bones you are whole. He stared at his hands. He listened to the beats of his own heart. He remembered the boys from Molestown, the farmers and smiths and fisher lads with their thin wrists and their ignorance and their courage, whom he had called south and brought back again because the world was larger than the laws that kept them out. He remembered men who said oath like a prayer and used it like a knife. "Am I a ghost?" he asked, because the room seemed paler than rooms had seemed before, and Davos barked a laugh and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "You're luckier than most ghosts," the smuggler said. "You still get to eat." In the days that followed, Jon moved like a boat through snaring weeds. Every step felt like a decision he could not fully consent to, and every breath was a kind of theft. When Sansa came to him under a weeping sky with the Vale's cold wind laid along her cheekbones and her hair unbound, she looked like a ghost given flesh, and when she put her arms around him he felt heat as if for the first time since he had woken. She told him of Ramsay Bolton as if she were placing stones into a bag. This and this and this, weighing them objectively to be carried by them both. They spoke of Winterfell and of fathers and of wolves. Later, in the mess hall that was not theirs, with the smell of boiled oats in the air, Jon said, "I do not want crowns. The last thing I wanted was to be..." He did not finish because he had been Lord Commander and it had killed him. Sansa's mouth thinned. What you want and what the North needs were seldom the same thing even when father lived. They took Winterfell back with mud on their faces and desperation in their guts. The Bolton's banners burned wetly in the rain, the flayed men's skins bubbling like old fat in a kettle. Snow-muffled screams. Jon fought as if he were drowning, and every push of Longclaw's edge broke the surface for one more breath, and then one more after that. He did not know how many he killed. Men blurred into shapes with weapons at the ends. Ramsay's arrows whispered by, and one of them scratched Jon's cheek, and he felt the blood and smiled a bare inch of smile because blood meant he was still a thing that could bleed. When the gates fell, when the Umber's betrayal cut back on itself like a scythe, when the Knight of the Vale's voice rose shrill and triumphant in the cold air, when the giant tumbled with spears through his lungs and made a sound like the end of a world, Jon found Ramsay, and Ramsay shot arrows into the shield he held until that shield was a hedgehog, and then the world narrowed to fists and bones. Sansa watched him hit the man who had called himself her husband until his knuckles bled and the bones of Ramsay's cheek whispered under skin. Jon stopped before he became the man he'd killed. When he raised his head, The courtyard was a pale bowl under pale sky, and the snow that fell on his fingers melted and ran down into the cuff of his glove, and that small discomfort was enough to prove he had not become a monster. Later, when the dogs were fed, Sansa stood in a doorway and did not speak for a long time. Her dress grew wet at the hem. Her hair lay heavy with snowflakes. "We need a word for what he made of me," she said at last. "Monster is too grand." "You are Sansa Stark," Jon said uselessly, and she laughed a short laugh that had nothing of humor in it and walked past him into the hall. Word of their victory rode south on cold winds and warm tongues. Men who had bent the knee to Ramsay found their knees again and cleaned them. Lady Mormont scolded the lords of the north with a scorn so hot it melted frost and lit old courage. The tall girl's eyes cut like axes. When the lords banged their cups and shouted a king into a room, Jon felt the word trying to slide down his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He looked at Sansa. Her eyes were very steady. She did not smile and she did not look away. In Greywater Watch, Meera stood on a causeway where ducks nested and watched mists blow in long, slow bands. Bran sat on a folding stool, Hodder behind him like a boulder with a face, Howland squatting like a heron. "The neck is our body," Howland said, touching a reed. "It expands when it drinks the rain and shrinks when it dries. It moves. If you ask it not to sink you, it may be kind. The Isle has different rules." "The Isle calls," Mara said behind them, quiet as a fish's fin. "It remembers your father's name. There is a white were there that has been trying to say Eddard for a long time." "I remember my father," Bran said. "I do not need a tree to do it." "That is the way," Howland said, and his eyes warmed. "Walk there with your own feet. Sit there with your own weight. If the trees try to lift you, let them feel your heaviness." They went to the Isle when the fog and the wind agreed it was time. The lake lay like gray iron under a sky the exact same color, so that it seemed the boats floated in nothing. Black swans cut versus in the water and left no wake. The island heaved itself up from the lake like the back of an old bull. Weirwoods grew there in a congregation so thick they were almost one trunk with 1,000 faces, pale and blotched and bleeding from eyes that never closed. The air smelled like old snow and sweet rot, and blood rubbed thin between fingers until it went brown. Bran's stomach made a small animal of itself so that he was a boy with another boy snarling just below his ribs. He breathed and listened and kept his heels on the ground. Howland touched a root. The pact was sworn here when war became exhausted and the making of children more urgent than the making of corpses. The trees drank men and children both before and after. They do not care which. They only want to drink. Do not let them make a cup of you. Mara went among the trees with a gourd of water and a knife. She cut her palm and let red drops fall on a pale root. She poured 3 drops of lake water onto the blade and then 3 more and made marks in the dirt with the point. Her voice, when she spoke, did not belong to any man Bran had ever heard. It belonged to the place and to old promises. Bran put his hand on white bark. It was cold. He did not close his eyes because he was done closing his eyes for voices. He looked at faces instead, at their different sorrows, their different hungers. In them he saw other things. Winter wolves stalking in waist-deep snow. A firelit tower where a girl with a crown of blue winter roses lay gasping. A marsh boy with a frog spear in his hands and a knight in a cloak of stars. Men breaking a stone with hammers of wood and prayer. Children pressing a knife of obsidian into a man's chest and making a mistake so large the earth bent under it. Words brushed his ear. "Come," said a woman, as if she knew him better than he did. "Come and don't be afraid." He stared at the face the words were coming from, the mouth etched into bark like a leaf's vein. "No," he said in a voice too small for this place. His legs were 2 dead fish below his body. His back ached. He wanted to pull his hand away and could not because he had set himself this task. "No, I am Bran Stark. I am not a crow and not a root." The voice grew fainter, like a mother in the next room. It receded. Only the humming remained, as of bees in winter. When he pulled his palm free, the skin was numb and white, and in it the grooves of the bark had left a pale map. Meera touched his sleeve. She had been crying without sound. "Thank you," she said, and did not explain why. Howland wiped his knife on his sleeve and pointed with it into the trees. "He will come soon." "Who?" "The one you were nearly meant for," Howland said. "But not now. Not with me standing here. Not with the woman you saved alive because you would not leave her. Choices matter." They did not sleep on the isle. The air there carried a rhythm that would not let sleep be whole. They drank lake water and ate fish dried to toughness and the marsh bread that Mara had baked. And when the dawn came, there was frost on the backs of the swans and a thin film on the lake's skin that broke like spun sugar when Howland's or touched it. When they returned to 𝒂𝒓𝒔𝒊𝒗𝒆𝒔, Howland penned a letter himself, with bronze ink and a reed quill, sealing it with mud and wax and a twist of rush. The seal bore a frog and a sword. "To Winterfell," he said, "by ways that won't be watched. The maesters teach men to straighten all things. They forget that some of the world is only crooked." The letter found Winterfell on a morning when the sky had the color of old bone and the air stung like nettles. Sansa broke the seal at the high table under the direwolf banners and read Howland's strokes. Jon watched her, wishing for the 1,000th time he could read faces like horses read wind. He saw the stilling of her mouth and the way one vein stood blue in her temple. "What does he say?" he asked. "That our parents made promises under red leaves and white," she said, folding the letter again and touching it to her lips. "That father saved this man's life long ago and he is done hiding. That he will come when the marsh is sure of our feet. And Bran." The name came into the room like a small, bright animal, and the men around the table, Lord Manderley and the Glovers and Lady Mormont and the other Northmen, turned as if to see it scamper. Jon did not know what he hoped. He had not let himself hope at all. Sansa laid her palm flat on the letter. "Alive, in the neck." He refused a cave that wanted to swallow him and came south instead. Jon's breath left him. He did not realize until he was breathing again how long he had been holding it on the chance that he would never need it. The letter promised more than hope. It spoke of stone with fire sleeping in it, dragon glass, frozen light, whatever names men had given to obsidian and its cold burn. It spoke of ancient laws. It spoke of water that could be called into moving, if the old bargains were respected and the old words said. It spoke of oaths. It spoke of Lyanna, whose name Jon did not like to look at on a page. There were other words on other pages then. Samwell Tarly, round and earnest, wrote from Old Town with ink-splattered fingers and told Jon of records no one had remembered to forget, of caches of dragonglass under a black island with a castle of dragon's bones, of how fuel burns cold in the right weapons. He wrote as a man writes when he is frightened but cannot pretend he is not curious. His delight embarrassed him and made him brave in equal measure. The paper smelt of ink and sea salt. News of a queen in the south rolled over the winds and through the ravens' nests. The queen had 3 dragons, and the men who loved the past and the men who feared the future put the same expressions on their faces when they heard it. Ships with cork jackets around their bellies came up the east coast, past the Dreadfort's cold stones and over the gray mouths of rivers. White Harbor rang to hammers, and Sir Davos looked small among the masts. "We will treat," Jon said, rubbing a thumb over the edge of Sam's letter, as if touch might pull meaning from paper like juice from a lemon. "If she is wise, she will come north. If she is mad, we will know." Sansa's smile was a little curved blade. "And if she is neither? Then we will learn something else," Jon said, and the way the words left his mouth made him think of his father, and he had to set the letter down to hold the feeling steady. Daenerys Stormborn set foot on Dragonstone with her mouth full of the smell of old fire and new salt and looked up at towers that had been described to her since before she had known she had languages. The stones under her boots were warm. The Black Castle felt like a vast beast that had slept a long time and did not mind visitors it considered amusing. Tyrion Lannister stood at her shoulder like a clever ghost and watched the waves gnaw the rocks. When the ravens came and the letters unfolded themselves like the wings they had ridden on, Tyrion read and read again and sipped his wine between questions. He wrote a note himself, sharp as chisel marks, and said, "The North asks for pride and aid and no more than that. They do not offer much. They do not ask too little. They ask for a queen to bend," said Missandei. whose voice had a music like the sea just before it reconsidered storm. They ask with the nakedness of hunger. "And what do you say?" Dany asked. "That I have learned that in this country a bending can look like a breaking and a breaking can look like a bending," 𝒔𝒊𝒔𝒏 answered. "But cold breaks everything." She flew one dragon north to see the breath of winter with her own eyes. The beast's wing beats were the sound of flags coming undone. Drogon loved the wind as if it were a lover. From high, the north lay like a map only half drawn. White strokes of forest, blank plains of snow, a scatter of roofs like seeds and thin black veins where rivers tutored themselves in ice. She saw the wall at last. It lifted its frozen face into the gray sky and had not the slightest interest in her. It was a thing that had been there before her and would be there after, or so it believed. At Eastwatch, she smelled fish and men and old fear. The men who came blinking into daylight to look at the dragon did not run. They stared as if she were the first red thing they had seen in months. "Is it true?" the commander asked her, his beard clotted with frost. "That you would treat?" "I would treat," Dany said, "and I will not pretend I am something other than what I am." "Good," he said. "We have a surfeit of pretenders this far north." Jon Snow came to Dragonstone by ship with Sir Davos and a few good men who were poor with words and excellent with hands. The journey took too long and not long enough. The sea had moods, and when it was in a mood like a sulking child, Davos coaxed it with old sailor songs and his hands on the tiller, and when it was in a mood like a generous aunt, it gave them wind and plenty of fish. Jon stood at the railing at night and watched the water shine with something alive under the surface and thought of ghosts he had almost been. When he stood in the great hall with the carved table, looking at the shape of Westeros worn to a shine under so many hands and arguments, and the mother of dragons entered with her men at her shoulders like parentheses, he did not kneel. The dragonfire caught the shadows and made them move. Her face was pale and her eyes were not cruel, which was, he discovered, a surprise to him. They spoke across the table. Titles clattered and fell to the floor like coins. He said winter and she said fire. He said dead and she said chains. Tyrion's eyes followed words like hounds. When Jon spoke of what marched out of the far north, he felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff describing air to people who had always lived underground. When Daenerys spoke of fathers and blood and what she had lost, her voice did not tremble, but sometimes she turned a ring on her finger as if the metal remembered heat. "I will not bend the knee," Jon said in the end, "because the men behind me have been bent enough, but I will bend my will to what must be done. Your stones hide a fire we need. Lend me your fire. I will lend you truth." "Then show it to me," said the queen, and she did not blink. He did not show her a captured thing, cowed and clattering in chains. He took her to Eastwatch when the world's edges were turning to glass and the sea had begun to freeze by increments. An inch today, 2 tomorrow, and the men who fished there learned to test the water with poles as if it had developed a conscience. The air burned cheeks and lungs. The horizon had teeth, white and close. The first whites came across the ice like poor men trying a bridge and discovering that the toll was only a life they had already stopped using. It was not a skirmish. It was a revelation. The men of the watch, hungry and tired and efficient, set lines of fire that guttered and died in wind fierce and contrary. They struck with dragonglass blades and watched things fall that bled not at all. When a pale figure taller than the men around it stepped onto the ice and raised an arm and the wind made a sound like glass singing, Dany felt her skin pebble and the dragon above her screamed a note he had not screamed before. Drogon's fire turned the first ranks into steam and nothing. The tall, pale one watched without expression, fleshed enough to count. His eyes blue as deep ice under thin water. "Fire," Jon said afterward when they stood with chafed faces in the shelter of the wall's shadow. "Does it kill them?" "It kills what is already dead," she said. Somewhere behind her a man laughed sharply and then was quiet. "Steel? That black stone." "Valyrian," said Jon. "Dragonglass." He held up a shard of glossy black, light seeming to cling to it like flypaper. "This cuts them permanently." "Then you have it," she said. And she learned how to say the word Winterfell without stumbling, and how to eat their heavy breads, and how to keep her fingers warm with a cup of thick broth that smelled like nothing she knew and everything she remembered. She learned the names of the houses that were not dead yet. She learned that wolves had different words for snow. The sea did not freeze uniformly. It skinned itself over in one place and left open water in another. The others learned the new terrain quickly because the winter they carried was precise. Eastwatch fell when the ice came like a floor sliding under the feet of men, surprised to find themselves in rooms they had never rented. No dragon died there. Men did. Too many men. The watch retreated along the wall's base like ants skirting a basin. When the blue-eyed ranks looked up at the wall, they did not look at it the way men looked at towers. They looked at it the way water looks at a cup. In the neck, Howland Reed counted frogs with cold fingers and watched the frost take the reeds like a milky fungus. "It comes," he said, and the way he said it made the reeds seem simpler and the winter more complicated. He came to Winterfell with Meera and with Bran and Hodder lumbering behind them with a bundle of spears on his back. He came by ways no man who kept a road would have recognized. He came through a little door in the kitchens like someone's uncle who had slipped out to smoke and come back in smelling of river. Sansa met him in the old solar where her grandfather had counted tithes and her grandmother had cut bread for men who loved her and men who only pretended. Howland Reed had eyes that slid around rooms and took everything with them the way water takes bits of leaf. He bowed, not as a man bows to a queen, but as a friend bows to a friend. He took Sansa's hand and turned it over as if there might be frog spawn in her palm. He looked at Jon a long time and smiled, the kind of smile you make when you taste the stew you learned from your mother and remember the way the house smelled as a child. "You look like him," he said, and Jon felt his insides rearrange themselves minutely, as if making room for another organ. They sat and listened to him. He told them a story Jon had known partly, in bits of dream and in a few true words Ned Stark had never meant to say. He told it with names and weather and the way swords looked in morning light. He told them of a tower and of men who had guarded it because honor did not have an off switch. He told of a girl whose strength had not been measured and whose fear had, and how she had used the one against the other and won anyway. He told of a babe whose head had smelled like milk even when there was blood all around and a winter wind coming under the door. He did not say the word king. Sansa did not either. Jon could feel the words circling the room like a bird that has lost its tree. He looked at Bran and saw that the boy who was his brother, and was also someone new, had put his hand flat on the wood of the table and left it there until the grain seemed to remember it. "I am not a raven," Bran said. "I will not be a tree. I will not be a king either, but I can help you remember. And forget," Howland said, not unkindly. "We may need both." Littlefinger died that winter without Bran speaking the sentence. Sansa did it because her knives were words and she had learned how to hold them by the blade without bleeding. The Vale's lords watched him as if he were a thing under glass but still capable of biting. The guards brought him in with his wrists bound and his mouth full of sentences. He smiled those sentences out into the air, and they hung there like mist, pretty with sunlight in them, without ever coalescing into water. Sansa set letters on the table, and the men looked at the letters and at her and then at him, and the smile did not leave his mouth but his eyes went flat. She spoke of a knife and of lies and of a girl pushed out a sky door. Arya stood at her shoulder, and sometimes her eyes were on Littlefinger's throat and sometimes they were on Sansa's hands as if the one directed the other. When it was done, his blood made a surprisingly small pattern on the flagstones. It looked like a child had learnt his letters there and given up. The cold thickened into a substance. The rivers became slow glass. The mists of the neck froze on their own breath and fell as needles. The others came like men in the first place, as if hands and feet remembered the grace that had once belonged to them, and then like patience, because the land belonged to anything that could wait. Men gathered. A queen with 3 dragons brought her unsullied in ships that made even the White Harbor men blink. The Dothraki rode through snow like men who had never drunk anything but sun and found frost intoxicating and treacherous. The northern lords squared their shoulders and remembered their fathers' names and then their mothers' names and then the names of dogs. The Manderleys baked bread no one could eat fast enough. �𝒊𝒔𝒊𝒐𝒏 counted barrels and spoke to men like a son whose father drank had learned to speak. And the men listened because he did not know how to lie properly. Tyrion put ink into lines of plans, and the ink froze in the wells, and he swore softly and heated it with his breath. He designed traps that used water because water was everywhere, and he listened to Howland's counsel as if he had been born in the neck and not among red tiles and vines. �𝒔 took men into the bogs and brought them back leaner and meaner and more tired and taught them to listen to frogs. Jon and Dany walked sometimes together along the Wintertown's lanes under a sky as bald as a skull. Her breath came in clouds and hers smelled like whoever she had kissed last because winter stole from the body silently and cruelly. They did not speak often because what they were making had too many moving parts to be described with any grace. Once they came to where the old heart tree stood, Winterfell's red leaves drooping under frost, and Dany touched the bark with 2 fingers and then pressed the fingers to her lips. "It is not mine," she said. "It is not ours," Jon answered, and when she looked at him he added, "It belongs to the dead and to the living who remember the dead. It belongs to the land. We borrow it." Her laugh made a small white cloud. "I have built my life on the idea of ownership," she said. "I find I must unlearn it to survive." The first battle in the neck was not so much a battle as a negotiation between water and cold. Moat Cailin had never been beautiful. In winter it was uglier, and ugliness served it well. The causeways were narrow and treacherous. Frost made lace of the reeds. Men slipped and cursed and sometimes simply sat down and cried in their beards when their feet gave out under them, and then they stood again because there were other men watching. The others tested the water with their cold and found where men had built wood under its surface, and the wood moaned as the cold took it. Dany's dragons flew low and laid fire out along the ice like red ribbons. Men with dragonglass-tipped spears fought to keep the dead from using the fire-warm channels as easy streets into living flesh. Arya moved through the winter like a knife through cloth. She killed another once with the Valyrian steel dagger that had a story in it like a thorn buried under skin. When she pulled the blade out, the other broke like the crust on a puddle in first frost, and the pieces were clear and showed her face in each shard, cut and multiplied, and none of them looked like the girl who had been afraid of thunder in the Tower of the Hand. Later she crept into a marsh-wet pavilion and put that same knife into a man whose name no one remembered 10 days after his birth and who had done more harm than his name could justify. She did not sleep more sweetly for either deed. Brienne of Tarth stood with her shield sunk 2 inches into mud and held the line where other men's arms would have trembled. And when another stepped toward her, its eyes looked surprised to find a woman between it and the living. She cut it down with Oathkeeper and thought fleetingly of the man who had given her that blade, and of his mouth when he was not trying to make it do what he thought men's mouths needed to do. Jaime Lannister came north with a face like a decided sin and a cloak the wrong color for the world. And because there were not enough swords to discard even those that had once killed men they loved, the North accepted him. He killed as if the act surprised him each time. He never took his glove off his maimed hand in the cold. He looked older than his years and younger than his shame. Cersei sat in the south and told men around her, men with soft fingers and softer eyes, that winter was an invention and that those who spoke of it had interests. "We do not go north," she said, "because we could not see a crown from there even if one were waiting." She sent Euron Greyjoy into the narrow sea with promises and horns that howled when men blew them and did nothing but stretch their lungs. Qyburn made soldiers out of whispers. When the fog rolled down the green fork like a tongue, it brought to Riverrun more cold than even Uncle Bryndon's patience had been able to resist. The second battle was a battle. The others came in force down the causeways, using cold as men use spears. The water groaned around them. The trees creaked as their sap failed. The reeds broke with little sounds like bones in birds. Drogon roared at a sky that had become stone, and Rhaegal and Viserion, who had not yet learned to love this air, fought their own worry as much as any enemy. Dany rode Drogon and felt heat bite the inside of her thighs and the cold bite the tip of her nose. Men below became shapes. Her breath condensed inside her helm and made clouds that mined her vision. She took it off in spite of sense and let winter kiss her face. The kiss hurt and woke her as no counsel had. Jon fought in the mire, and the mire took some and let others have purchase. He killed an other that came on like inevitability, and when it shattered, the whites around it fell like marionettes with cut strings. Men cheered raggedly in iced throats. Tyrion's lines of oil burned blue-white where the cold had pressed the water as thin as skin. Davos's signals went up as smudges. Then nothing. Smoke froze and fell. Howland Reed appeared in places and disappeared in others like a fish under a lily pad. The Night King did not come to Moat Cailin. He was not drawn to stone as much as to the red and white trees beyond, where memory pooled. He marched with a small guard along the Green Forks bank, leaving frost behind him that did not melt at noon. He avoided the phrase weeping towers with the indifference of one who knows already that all men who make bridges for profit die of one of three things: debt, misfortune, or their sons. His face did not change because it could not. It had been carved into what it was. He listened to the wind, and the wind hymned a word in a language dead before men had learned to carve runes. Home. On the Isle of Faces, Bran lay under a pile of furs and watched the leaves not move. He had not slept much. He ate what Mara brought him and tried not to listen to the small movements of the living under the trees, for fear of hearing the larger movement of what had never died. He thought of the cave. He had not gone into the way a man thinks of an affair. He did not have and imagines the shape that would have been his life if he had sinned. He did not regret. His regrets belonged to smaller things. A sweet cake he had not eaten because he had been sulking that day. A boy's horse he had not ridden hard enough. A promise to Rickon that he would teach him how to shoot sitting down because it had seemed so silly and obvious. He thought of his mother's hands, of how they had smelt sometimes of flour and sometimes of iron. Howland crouched beside him and set a small packet on Bran's chest. It was wrapped in soaked leather. Bran pushed the thong back with his thumb and found a sliver of black glass inside and a twist of hair the color of the inside of a chestnut and a thin, flat rune carved into a chip of white wood. "I am not a wizard," Bran said. "Neither am I," Howland answered. "Men call magic what the world does when it is tired of being reasonable." "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to remember," Howland said. "I want you to remember so loudly that anything who has forgotten what it was has to hear you and has to be something again. Names are nets. Throw yours." When the Night King came onto the isle, the air tightened like the skin of milk in a pan left to cool. The red leaves were still. The lake made a sound like something trying to breathe under ice. A slow, soft thrum. Men with spears stood among the trunks and lifted them, and their hands shook, but not because of fear. Dany's dragons burned the edge of the island and made an ugly halo. Jon Snow was a strip of darkness moving between paler strips, with Longclaw a line of night in his hand, Brienne at his left and Arya somewhere no one could see and everyone could feel. Bran set his palm to bark. He did not close his eyes. He did not dive. He did not surrender. He let the tree be a tree and he let himself be a boy. He spoke his name. It sounded like the breaking of ice on a stream when the thaw comes. He spoke his father's name. He spoke his mother's. He spoke Rickon and wished that name went where it could be heard. He spoke Robb's and felt pain in his mouth like a bit. He spoke Lyanna and the wind moved across the island, though the leaves did not. He spoke Ned again and again until the air tasted of winter apples. He spoke names of men he had never met but who had been wolves who had run and run long before any of this and whose bones had been stones under other men's feet. He spoke the name he did not know was a name until it was in his mouth. The Night King's name from before he had a crown of cold. It had been a simple name when it belonged to a man. It had a mother in it and a riverbank and the smell of wood smoke. It had sweat that had been sweet and then sour. It had the shape of a laugh he had once had. Bran did not know how he knew it. Perhaps Lyanna had birthed it. Perhaps the Isle had coughed it up like a fishbone that had been irritating its throat for 100 centuries. He spoke it and the air changed. The Night King paused. His guard paused. His eyes moved, which was almost expression. Dany sent Drogon down into that moment and the fire spread in sheets that snapped at their edges as if something were chewing them. Jon ran. Brienne ran with him, her breath a ragged sound in the quiet. The world became narrower than a man's hand and infinite as a man's fear. They met on ground hard with old roots. The Night King's blade shone like the inside of a glacier. �𝒊𝒒 met it, and the sound they made had a pitch that had never been in Winterfell's yard. Jon did not feel his feet. He felt the cold through his gauntlets and up his arms to his teeth. He felt his lungs claw at the air. He felt the swords talk. Behind him Arya was somewhere, always somewhere, and the sound of Drogon's wings was the sound of 10,000 standards snapping on a mountain. Dany's second dragon screamed then. Viserion took a spear of ice in his wing and spiraled, thrashing, the membrane tearing with a sound of cloth ripping, huge cloth, a queen's veil. He did not fall to be taken. He crashed into the lake and made steam, and then he rose again, lame but furious, and Dany closed her legs around Drogon and clenched her teeth and tasted blood. Rhaegal raked pale troops with fire until the ice beneath them went bright and then black. Bran spoke the name again. He did not scream. He let it go into the air like a thing that belonged there. He spoke as if he were laying a bowl on a table. The Night King's head tilted minutely. Around him whites paused and then staggered as if something had gone out of them and then come back wrong. Jon drove forward, both hands on �𝒊𝒒's hilt. Their swords struck sparks that had no heat. The Night King lifted his offhand, and the cold rose out of the ground like a mist and made Jon feel like a child who had been made to stand naked in the snow while men laughed. Brienne came in then, her shield up, and took the brunt of a stroke on that wood, and the shield split. She did not fall. She hit back, Oathkeeper finding a seam in cold. The Night King did not bleed. That was not what the blade did. It made a sound in him like a note in a bell, and the men around them felt it in their teeth, and an old tooth of Davos's that had never quite stopped aching after a storm went suddenly silent. Arya came like a thought you almost have and then have. The dagger in her hand was small and bright as a sliver of moon. She went for the place under the arm, where armor on men had gaps, where ribs lifted to make room for breath. The Night King had no breath. He moved with a speed that did not belong to men and would have shattered her arm if it had met it. But the blade struck the join of his pauldron and his breastplate and slid along, carving a line of nothingness that looked like frost. He turned toward her, and Jon did something he would not remember ever deciding to do. He threw �𝒊𝒒. The sword turned end over end in the slowest motion anyone had ever seen. The Night King pivoted, and the blade missed his face by an inch and struck the weirwood behind him, biting into white, and the tree's sap came out like tears. The Night King's eyes went to the sap. Bran spoke the name again. It was not the blade that undid him. It was the name. It put a life in him, not the one he had been making out of cold for an age, but the small, clumsy, human one. It made the violence done to that life once visible to him again, and it was the kind of thing that cannot be endured. Men have been known to die of shame and memory. Gods can too, when what they are keeps a human bone tucked into their throat. He reached for Jon, whose hands were empty. Brienne's sword caught his wrist. Arya's dagger bit at his waist. Dany's dragonfire washed over a ring of whites until there were none at all between the fight and the lake. The Night King's blade came up, down, and Jon, who had a boy's stubbornness and a man's acceptance, reached with both hands and took the weirwood slick hilt of �𝒊𝒒 and pulled it from the tree and drove it forward in the same breath. The steel that had once known fire met the ice that had once known a heart. It did not go into his chest as much as into his past. When it did, the Night King let out a small noise like a man surprised to see his mother in a doorway he had thought he had bricked up. His body did not explode spectacularly. Spectacles belonged to men now. He went as a frost goes when the sun hits it just right, shivering and gone, leaving behind dampness that would be a stain if the ground had not been thirsty. Across the island, across the long lines of reeds and the uglier, longer lines of causeways, across the river and the roads and the winter woods, the whites fell. They fell the way men fall asleep when they are exhausted, abruptly, gracelessly. The others cracked and went to dust like a glass dropped on an old flagstone floor. The cold did not go. It would not go for months. It had come honestly by the sky, but the intent in it lessened. Men felt the difference the way a man feels the difference between rain that will ruin a roof and rain the roof will endure. Bran took his hand from the bark. His palm was bloodless. Howland put a cloak around his shoulders that smelled of peat smoke and honey. The red sap on the tree had already crusted. Dany brought Drogon low and slid off his back as if the ground might punish her if she stamped it. Her face was white and chapped, and she had bitten her lip until it bled. She looked at Jon and at Arya and at the broken shield at Brienne's feet, and at the men gathering themselves with hands that did not shake now that the shaking would have been useful, and said nothing. Jon wiped Longclaw on a White's hair and then on nothing at all. He looked at Bran and nodded once, quick as a knife. That night the island was loud with men who did not know how to be quiet with relief. They drank bad beer that tasted like victory and piss and laughed too loudly at poor jokes because the laughter made them warm from the inside out. Arya sat with her back to a tree and closed her eyes for a minute and then opened them because sleep would bring faces. Brienne mended a strap because she could not sit still. Jaime came to sit near her and not speak. His breath made white plumes and his nose was red. Davos taught Tyrion a game with good odds and bad stakes, and Tyrion won until he realized the stakes and stopped playing. Mira went among the bunks with a pot of something hot and a spoon and made men take a mouthful each before they could go back to shouting. Howland told the mists to behave, and for once they did. Jon and Dany walked around the island's edge. The sky wore a few stars like a poor woman's necklace. The air had the taste of water and ash. "You said you would show me truth," Dany said. "You have." "It is ugly," Jon said. "Ugliness is honest," she said. "I have known enough beauty that lied." He started to speak and did not. He had not told her the whole of what Howland had told. The words of it had sat under his tongue because he had not known how to share them without changing the shape of everything else they were trying to make. Now the night seemed like a patient thing, and he looked at her, and she looked back as if the night had told her to be patient too. Howland said, "My mother." He did not say the name at once. He let his lips shape it slowly. "Lyanna." He said, "My mother loved a man she was not supposed to love, and he named that man." His breath smoked in the air and blew back into his face. He said there were vows under trees that men did not recognize because they were not in halls. He said, "My name, the one she gave me." He let the name come out soft. The night took it away like a good secret. Dany did not step back. She did not clasp his arm and call him brother. She did not do any of the things he had rehearsed for her. She stood with the discipline of a woman who has trained dragons, which is to say with courage and with pain. "I have no brothers," she said at last, not without regret. "I had a brother and he was a terrible thing, and I learned the shape the word makes in the mouth with the taste of fear in my spit. I do not fear you. I do not want a crown from it," Jon said quickly, because he felt the night begin to try to arrange itself into future shapes and wanted to scatter them before they settled. "I do not want to be a king of something I cannot hold in my teeth when the cold comes again, and it will again sometime, no matter how brave we are." She gave a short smile. "You may not want crowns, Jon Snow," she said, "but crowns seem to want you." She lifted a hand and looked at it as if she were reading lines there. "I do not know what I want, for the first time since I have been old enough to want anything. I know what I need. I need men who do not lie and fires that do not go out." "Then take both," Jon said. "Take the south. Let the north stand as it has stood. No man who knows our winters should look to men who do not know them for their bread. Call it a pact or a compromise, or the way the world is when it recovers from too much certainty." She laughed, and the laugh misted the air. "I have burned my certainty more than once," she said. "Perhaps I should stop setting it on fire. Perhaps I should fold it and put it in a drawer and look at it when I am tired." In the morning, a raven went south with a letter no one had believed they would write. It was iron straight and plain as oat bread. It had no curlicues. It had names and seals and the outline of a future in it that could be born without choking. It offered a queen her throne and kept a king without using the word, and balanced them with customs that were older than either kind of power. The men who read it in the South argued as men argue when their dinners are at stake and not their souls. In the end, bread won. Bread nearly always does. Cersei read the letter and had a sword brought to her rooms and ran a cloth up and down the blade for an hour without noticing that the cloth was black and the sword clean. Then she cut the cloth in half and told 𝒂𝒓𝒔 to bring her something with teeth to plan with, and found that she had none left with which to bite. When word reached her that the Riverlands had welcomed a winter queen and a summer queen both, she looked at her maps as if they were hopelessly out of date. And they were. Men came to her and said things that sounded like advice and were really many small whimpers. She told them to leave and sat in the dark until morning because she could not bear the universe without an audience, and yet the audience had gone. She died later of a small, precise poison administered by a small, precise hand. And no one wrote songs because no one who had known her could carry a tune for that long. Spring came late and grudging, came in the margins first. A puddle that no longer froze thick enough to bear a child's foot. A weed making a brave mistake in a crack in the stones. A bird that sang as if it had been bullied into it and then discovered it liked the noise it made. Men unwrapped their hands from cloths they had slept with and found their fingers raw and shocked and still theirs. Women burned bedding that had housed too much fear. Children learned how to throw snowballs that turned to slush midway and laughed in spite of melting gloves. The dragons hunted beyond the gift and came back with mammoth calves in their jaws and the smell of tundra in their scales. And the men of the watch grumbled about droppings but did not fail to remember that their fathers' had never seen anything so good as those shapes in the sky. Bran did not become a tree. He went to Winterfell between thaws and sat under the red leaves and listened to the ordinary noises people make when they think they are not being listened to. He watched Sansa listen to men and then correct them without humiliating them. And he saw the way her face softened around children because the North would have none if it did not turn its heart toward them. He watched Arya grow restless at hearths and then go again. Not west this time, but into the north to find the places even maps had given up on and make lines there with her footsteps. He watched Davos fix men like boats. He watched Tyrion regret and then stop regretting and start calculating with kindness in it because it turns out kindness needs arithmetic too. He watched Dany learn to sleep in a bed that did not smell like the sea and then go away for a month because her bones had developed a habit of movement and people should not try to break the bones they must live in. On a day when the air was thin and the sun sat like a well-polished coin above the yard, Jon stood at the heart tree and laid his palm against the bark. It had the feel of bone. The name carved into the weirwood by Longclaw's scratch was nearly grown over. Trees forget injury better than men. He spoke his father's name. The wind did not answer, but it moved a lock of hair across his brow, and he smiled at the immodesty of thinking the wind would choose him. He did not wear a crown. Men called him by the names they needed, and he wore them like clothes, putting them on in the morning and taking them off at night. He went to the wall sometimes and ate stew out of a cracked bowl and listened to men who did not think they had voices. He went to the villages and let old women thump his chest with knuckles and say you are too thin. He wrote letters to a queen, and sometimes he burned them and started over because the ink had wandered toward heat where it did not belong. He met a dragon in the air once, not because he was a man of legend but because the sky was wide, and it looked at him and he looked back and they parted without need of anyone's story. Bran went back to the Isle in spring with Howland and Meera and Hodder, because the Isle is like a patient that appreciates consistency. He took with him a small carved wolf that Rickon had once made out of wood with a knife he was not supposed to use. He set it at the base of the tree that had drunk the Night King's last wrong breath and told it to guard the roots against their own hunger. He did not know if the object understood, but he understood, and sometimes that is enough. He put his hand to the bark and listened. The voices that came were quieter now, and some were laughing. When the sun turned the lake to tin, he fell asleep without meaning to and dreamed of a warm hall and meat and the sound of a swelling belly of a lute and his mother's voice telling him to eat more quickly because the men would take the good bits if he did not. And he woke hungry and glad. The realm did not become kind because winter receded. It became itself. Wars do not end because the heroes go to bed. They end because the tired people who live under them decide to stop feeding them. Dany found that ruling was a matter of knowing when to say maybe, and Jon found that holding a north that wanted to be held by no one in particular required a particular genius for not being particularly intrusive. Sansa learned which lords could be encouraged to be brave by being trusted and which had to be frightened into decency. Arya learned that some faces could not be worn because to lift them would be to steal something that should remain even if it was a flaw, and she learned to leave those alone. Brienne taught boys and girls to use swords like prayers, not like curses. Jaime wore a plain cloak and stopped looking at his reflection in icy windows. Tyrion learned how to be happy in increments. Davos raised a small hall on land too rocky for crops and filled it with boys who could not keep fathers and taught them to keep themselves instead. When the harvests came late but came, men held up turnips like crowns. People who had sworn not to cry cried for very foolish reasons. Because a child laughed with bread in both hands, because a bolt of wool was not damp, because a door made in summer did not warp in autumn. The spring that followed that spring began to smell like beginnings properly do. Damp, messy, hopeful, reluctant. Bran sat at Winterfell's parapet in evening and watched the birds write their abridged histories across the sky. He thought of caves and crowns and what men do when trees offer them immortality. He wondered at the arrogance of believing memory belonged in one head. He let his own memories loosen like good breadcrumbs. He did not hold them tightly. He watched the ice melt water run under the bridge and away toward rivers he had not yet forgiven for their indifference, and then toward seas that did not care at all. He found comfort in that. Sometimes, very rarely, in the middle of night when the castle slept and the kitchen fire was the only thing awake and a scullion turned in her sleep in the warmth beneath it, the wind would come over the walls with a smell of old frost and something that had once been sorrow and was now only weather. It touched his face, and he said a name into it. Not his name, not the name of his father or his mother. A smaller name, a human one he had given back to a thing that had forgotten it and had not forgiven the forgetting until the last possible moment. The wind went on. The trees and the gods would whisper together as if deciding what to do when men came asking for too much again. And Bran smiled into the dark because he knew now that men would ask and that sometimes the answer could be no. He slept then, deep and without voices, with the ordinary dreams of a man who has done what he could and a boy who still wanted to run. In that sleep, once, he dreamed that wolves ran through shallow water under willows, and their prints filled with sky, and the sky did not complain. In the morning, the mists on the moat lifted slowly and made currents of sunlight on the stones, and Winterfell kept its weather like any other house, and the men and women inside it kept their promises, and somewhere in the bogs a frog croaked a word that sounded like a blessing and like a joke, and Howland Reed, waking, smiled without opening his eyes. The thaw began at the edges of things no one cared to notice. A drip marked time on the eaves of the old kennel. A sheen of wet laid itself along the north face of a standing stone like a hand at rest. Straw on the stable floor went from brittle to sour. The moat's rim darkened an inch in from the ice where the sun slid across it and then stayed. A dark ring growing day by day until it was a belt. Men said the word mud again the way you say the name of a neighbor you can endure. Bran rolled his chair into the godswood and put his palm to the weirwood as if counting his own pulses. The white bark was as cold as bone kept from fire on purpose. He stood in a dream at the edge of a lake and heard women singing words older than hunger. Then he opened his eyes to ravens shifting on black branches and told himself the song was nothing but wind. A boy brought a loaf too hot to slice and stood waiting, not sure if he should speak. Bran took the bread and tore it, burning his thumbs. "Tell the kitchens to keep the ovens running," he said. "There are men in the yard with less fat than a cat." The boy's mouth went to a line, disciplined around eagerness, and he ran. Jaime Lannister found him there near dusk, alone except for the tree and Winter's left hand. The man wore plain wool, his fine hair grown out to a carelessness he had never been made to know before, the gold of it dimmed to wheat in low light. He stopped as if the roots had reached for his ankles. Bran waited for him to speak, and when he did and the words came out shaped like an apology held warm too long, Bran lifted his palm. "Don't," the boy said, quiet. "If you give that day more words, it will begin to believe it needed them." Jaime's mouth tightened. "I took much from you. You took what the fall took," Bran answered after a space, with an honesty that surprised him when he heard it. "And you gave me something too, I think. What could I?" And he bit off the end because it begged for comfort, and he had decided somewhere along a long road that begging was a bad habit. He stood instead, and the cold made his breath visible and humble. "The world is not something you look down at from a tower," Bran said. "It is a thing you look at from whatever place you have. You took my tower away. I would have climbed worse ones if you hadn't." His hands were on the rims of his wheels, and he pushed them a half-inch forward and back. It made a small, thoughtful sound on the path. "You thought to kill a boy. You killed a part of him. The rest learned other tricks." Jaime inclined his head with more respect than he had once offered kings. "Then let the rest live," he said, and turned his face toward the red leaves as if the tree had asked something under its breath. Elsewhere in the yard, steel spoke to wood and lost. Brienne had a new shield, broad and plain, and children took turns striking it with blunted sticks while she corrected their wrists and stances, and told them not that their arms were wrong, but that the ground could be kinder if their feet knew it. Arya watched from the wall for while the way a cat will watch birds it has no intention of catching just then dropped lightly and cut in when a boy larger than his sense tried to bully his way through a bad guard. She did not knock him down because that would have given him a story to keep. She turned his wrist until his stick fell and made him pick it up with his left hand and try again. He tried, which pleased her. When the lesson ended, she gave him a drink and asked him what he had been most afraid of. "Dropping the stick," he said. "The stick is nothing," Arya told him. "Hands are a history. Keep those." A rider with the smell of salt across his gear came through the east gate at noon the next day and made straight for the Great Hall. His face under the helm showed windburn and a set of lines that bad sleep carves. He bore a little way more courage than was safe to show in Winterfell if you did not know what you were doing. When the doors opened, Sansa looked up from the board where she was laying out measures of barley and measures of patience and saw the crescent of the kraken stitched over his heart. He knelt, too fast, then steadied himself with a fist on the stone. "Ymhra Greyjoy sends me," he said. "The Crow's Eye holds the shields and takes what he pleases along the Mander with a fleet fat on plunder. He has a horn he says speaks to dragons, but it only makes fools blow their lungs inside out. He says he will take the Reach and light the arbor at night for a jest." Sansa touched the edge of the barley with 2 fingers, aligning a line that had wandered. "And what does Ymhra want?" "Ships to burn ships," the man said, "and men to kill men, and a promise that when this is done the Iron Islands will not have to eat rocks and pride." Davos, leaning at the hearth with his arms folded, sucked his teeth in thought. "If the Crow's Eye has the shields," he said, "Old Town sits and counts candles while it waits to be plucked. You don't let a man sit his arse on your doorstep with a knife in his hand and a song in his throat." "The Reach bled itself for kings who didn't pay," Tyrion said mildly from his chair's corner. "They'll not rise as one for a queen they do not yet know, Lady Manderly." He looked to Sansa with the smallest of bows. "It would be politic to send a wolf to keep the kraken off their coasts." Sansa's face did not change, but her thumb pressed into her palm and left 4 crescent marks there. She had learned a new craft this winter, the making of silences with a shape to them. "Send word to Dragonstone," she said. "Tell the queen the sea calls. Tell her it calls rudely." The raven went out as evening folded and returned quicker than couriers ought to, as if the wind had been bribed to hurry. Dany came with 2 ships that cut the gray like knives and with a third barely worth the name, full of Dothraki who hated every inch of deck and grinned at every taste of spray, and with her unsullied marching from White Harbor along the coast road in lines of clean intent. Drogon arrived before any of them, because news is only a rumor until a dragon casts its shadow over your table, and the cooks ran out into the yard to watch him circle, and some dropped ladles as if their hands had remembered that they had been children once. "Boats and fire don't mix well unless the fire is a polite servant," Davos muttered when the council Saturday. "We'll need wind and tide and a place to force the Crow's Eye to choose badly." "Make him choose more than once," Tyrion said. "Choice is a spice that ruins any stew if you put too much of it in." Jon traced a finger along the map from Seaguard down the coast to the mouth of the Mander. "The shields are stones in a stream," he said. "You can part a current with stones, or you can smash yourself on them. The Crow's Eye will be at Third Sister or Green Shield, somewhere he can strike and seem clever. If he has taken the shields, he has also taken pride, and pride is a sail that does not reef in a squall." "Take the mouth," Dany said. "If we choke the Mander, he has no way to bleed the Reach. He'll come for us there." "How?" asked Missandei. leaning over the map with a focus that always made Tyrion's respect sit up straighter. "If we make a net, where are the knots?" Davos's finger tapped 3 points, confident as a man counting masts in fog. "Here, here, and here, shoals like old bones. With your leave, my lady, I'll put a dozen boats where men think there's only 6, and when the tide turns we'll let them drift like dead things and then pull them tight like a purse string." Dany's mouth quirked. "You have leave," she said. "You have more than leave. I would have you teach me the sea's letters." "You don't read a sea," Davos said with a sunk laugh. "You ask it if it feels like being read." They sailed into the Mander under a sky the color of pewter gone soft at the edges. The crows I came to meet them swanning on wind that did not belong to him. His sails black and his prows carved with obscene mouths and his laughter audible across water that did not see why sound should be given so far a reach. The horns he had brought from somewhere of old lies wailed and 3 men died where they stood, lungs scoured by a note that did nothing to dragons and less than nothing to the sea. The Reach men on the riverbanks shouted prayers to gods whose ears were full of reeds. The first volleys of arrows fell short and then did not. Men bled red into water that had been green. The net held. Davos's boats lay dull in the water where he had told them to act like drift, and then came together at his signal with a spite the tide approved of. Euron's lead longship shuddered and slew half a turn and ground on oysters it had not asked to be introduced to, and men poured forward and backward both until they were a confusion of falling. The Unsullied on the northern bank did not roar because their discipline was not made of sound. They loosed in files and men fell in files. The Dothraki on the south bank liked the way a horse's hoofs through river water as if it were blood, and they screamed and the river screamed back. And in later days Reach lords would swear the sound had changed the taste of the Mander for a week. Dany did not bring Drogon down upon the ships. She had listened to Davos when he spoke of tar boiling and timbers screaming and men cooking in iron like lobsters. She took the dragon higher where the wind was a colder bite and used fire cleverly. Here to blind the crow's eyes archers, there to lick at a rudder's seam until Oak remembered sap and gave. Regal slid into a low pass and broke a mast like a dry reed. Viserions' wing whistled whined the way a harp makes a note if it is tuned for storms. Tyrion stood on a knoll and watched men drown and made himself count, because numbers are a penance one can do in public. Euron came amidships on his own deck, as if he had never learned that arrows grow out of men who stand announced. He wore iron that drank light and a grin that wanted to be a kingdom. Theon found him there when the net closed and smoke stripped the ship's name off its stern. He had come from the north bank in a boat that had likely been made to fetch baskets of cod, and he climbed with hands that had done worse things than climb and found his uncle where the black mast had ripped the sky. "You run to me as if you want to die," Euron said, loving it. "Did you miss me, nephew?" Theon's mouth twisted. "I have not missed you a single day," he said, and there was relief in the honesty that made his grip better than it had been since he was a boy larking in pools at Pike. He went in low and to the left, because men who bragged turned their right shoulder toward the world, as if the world should know which hand to fear. He took a cut along the cheek that opened him like an old bag, and it bled in his eye and made him blink, and Euron laughed and laughed until Theon's knife went under the vambrace and found meat. The old kraken made a sound like a father stubbing his toe and was angrier for it. He hauled Theon close with a fist in his hair and hissed a word that had lit fires in him once and made him who he did not have to be anymore, and Theon spat into his mouth like a child and brought his own head forward like a ram and felt bone strike bone. For long seconds there were only hands and breath and iron and old stories tearing. Then Yara's axe came from the melee at the rail, because she had leapt a span that would be talked about for months, and the edge took Euron below the ribs and made 2 problems of him. He staggered and leaned on the mast, the half of him that remembered pride trying to keep him upright. His eyes went to the dragon shadow on the water, then down to Theon's face. "Reek," he said, as if a name were a curse that could thread a man to a stake. "My name is mine," Theon said, and pushed. Euron went into the Mander's green mouth and the river shut it peremptorily. The fight broke into pockets of sudden quiet and sudden panic as men realized their captain had been a way of holding fear together. Yara hauled Theon by the back of his leather into the shelter of the mast and held his face between her hands for a moment that had the shape of a prayer without any god listening. "I thought you were dead again," she said, and he grinned crookedly because blood ran into his mouth and made a salt tang there. "Me too," he managed. "I think I kept forgetting to be." They burned the ruined longships later, after the Reachmen had come out with their banners and their gratitude bundled up as caution. The smoke drifted over orchards and made bees confused for a while. Dany stood with Davos watching the last hull go to black bones and then to ash. "You were right," she told him. Davos scratched his cheek with a finger as blunt as any truth. "I'm right as often as any old fool," he said. "You were right to listen." At Old Town, the bells rang not for warning this time, but because men needed to hear something clean. The Citadel opened its doors and let Samwell Tarly walk in with a parchment case under his arm and a girl on his heel and a baby in her shawl and a mind as full of questions as the sky is of wind. The Archmasters frowned at his lack of hat and at the laugh that kept dampening the edge of his sentences. He showed them copies of pages he had made and pages he had found and pages he had guessed at and pages that had come to him in letters smelling of pine pitch from the north. He laid dragonglass on a table and asked if they wanted another age of men who denied cold the way old men deny their own breath on winter mornings. They told him to sit his examinations with dignity, and he did, and when they made noises about oaths and rules, he smiled at them until their noises weakened. "I will be a maester," he said in the end, staring a man old enough to have forgotten why he'd loved books into silence. "But I will be my own sort of maester. I will write true things into the margins where other men's truths have grown stiff. I will send girls home with books. I will send boys out with questions." They could not stop him because the world had given him permission in the White Reek at the edge of a frozen lake, and the Citadel, for all its chains and candles, had no authority that mattered against that. In King's Landing, the ash that had rhymed roofs and tongues in other tellings remained in the kiln and the firepot. There were no bells rung for surrender and no women running like torn banners. The gates stood open because Tyrion had written 3 letters and made 7 visits and poured 10 cups of wine for men who believed they hated him and found after the 4th cup that hate was too much work. Dany rode through the city on a gray mare not much to look at, with dragons overhead and unsullied walking like thoughts you need to hold on to. The small folk looked up and then down and then up again and then offered bread because she looked hungry and because everyone is when kings change hands. The throne room smelled like dust and lemon oil. The Iron Throne was smaller than stories had made it and uglier, which recommended it to her. It had the look of a thing people had bled on. She did not sit it that day. She walked past it to the open doors and stood where a draft touched her neck and looked out over a city that had a habit of burning and said to no one in particular, "Let's not." The small council's table sprouted new growth. Tyrion at one end, Missandei to keep the words in order, Grey Worm to keep the men in order, Lord Davos who refused his lordship but took it anyway because boys read better when someone pays for the candles, a master of coin who had once been a brown-nosed scribe and had become a woman with talent for sums because war had killed enough men that competence could finally show its head, a high septon whose hands trembled because he remembered fire and had decided that faith would mean loaves and blankets for a time and not whips. Varys was nowhere because sometimes a wind stops blowing and no one thinks to name the moment it does. They argued without rancor because none of them had very much certitude left. Tyrion proposed a great council to recognize what the world had already decided, that a dragon could not hold snow, and snow could not warm a city of 500,000, and both would live if they stopped pretending otherwise. Dany listened and thought of words like breaking and wheel and how sometimes you break a thing by setting it down and walking away from it. She sent ravens with plain sentences and won because plain sentences are the only ones that survive weather. The lords and ladies came to Harrenhal because the castle always had room for a few hundred more souls, and its broken bones did not awe those who had learned lately to be unimpressed by ruins. The Riverlands had brought bread, and the Vale brought neat accounts, and the Reach brought wine, and the Stormlands brought a noise like thunder each time a man put his cup down too hard. Dorne sent silks and a woman with a voice like sand at night who said little and saw much. The North sent Sansa, and the North sent Jon, and the North sent the quiet that falls around a wolf's paws when it walks into a room. Edmure Tully wept openly at the first session. then laughed at himself for it and sat with his wife and child and signed what he was told to sign, because peace can be a kind of bravery. �𝒊𝒔𝒉𝒕 Baratheon stood at the foot of the table with his hands behind his back, as if he thought he might be asked to scrub it when they were done. Dany called him forward and named him what he was, his father's get, his own man, and told him he should sleep at Storm's End if he liked loud nights and louder weather. He shook because the notion of owning a place still surprised him, and because he could see Arya at the far end of the hall standing with arms folded, her mouth align, and he could not tell if she was scowling or trying not to smile. The agreements spilled themselves onto parchment and dried with speed because a dozen careful hands held them. The North would be the North and govern its winters and its bread and its stubbornness. The South would be the South and govern its ports and its taxes and its penchant for drama. There would be a levy of ships in place of a levy of swords, because ships carry wheat and winter medicine and people who will be friends to each other if you put them side by side long enough. The faith would keep its bells and keep them rung for births and harvests and not for judgments with flames in them. The Iron Islands would be permitted to go on being miserable and free, and Yara, who had survived that childhood and had the scars to show it, smiled at the thought as if misery could be made into a blanket if you folded it cleverly. Some men did not sign. There is always salt in the dough. A lordling from the Westerlands whose father had died with a debt ledger under him rose and called Dany by the names his father had liked for men who frightened him. He was quieted not by threat but by arithmetic. Tyrion stood and read the list of harvest yields from 3 villages in his domain and asked by what miracle the man intended to salt fish with pride. Another from the Stormlands stood and began to recite a genealogy that was beautiful in its uselessness, and Gendry cleared his throat and said, "I was born in Flea Bottom and can shoe and forge and make a plow as true as any you've seen. I know creeks in the marches you could hide a cart in. I can swim the Blackwater without stopping. Will any of that help your people eat?" The man sat, slowly, as if discovering humility in his joints. After the council, Arya found Gendry in a court below a broken tower, smoothing his hand along the stone of a new anvil as if it were a mare he hoped to calm. When he looked up, she had the same half-smile as before, and this time he could name it. "Storm's End suits you," she said. "It looks like a hammer struck the coast there and left a dent." "I like it," he said, surprised to hear how simple the truth sounded. "It's good to have walls that weren't built by debt." He hesitated, then blurted, "Would you?" and stopped, because men ruin good words by giving them too many frills. She shook her head, kind. "I am too much a road to be a room," she said. "I would be terrible at being a lady. I would be worse at being happy watching someone be good at being a lord." She reached out and set her palm on his shoulder in a gesture that remembered how to be older than both of them. "I will come to your forge sometimes and strike a bar with you, and we will see if the steel complains less when we do it together." "Always," he said. He watched her go and felt both robbed and enriched by the same act, and decided that was an adult's feeling and could be borne. A letter reached Winterfell the following spring bearing the sketched seal of a tower perched as if daring the sea to take it, and a bit of tar smeared where the seal had been pressed. It was from Sandor Clegane, and no one in the hall wanted to be the first to say so. Sansa broke it and read without changing her face. He was at the quiet isle where the monks whispered like grass and did not ask names. He mended nets and dug graves and let those occupations take turns with a shovel between them. He said the hound had died on a hillside in the Riverlands, and it had been a bad death and a good one both, and if any wanted to come and tell him news that was not stupid, they would be welcome to share a bowl of fish and a silence. Brienne went, not because she owed the man anything, but because debts can be paid in relief as well as coin. Jaime went with her, and if he had hoped for a confession from a man in a hood, he did not get one. They stood on the strand and watched the tide decide where to lay itself and spoke very little. Sandor looked thinner and thicker both, the way men do when they have put down one weapon and picked up another and have not learned yet whether the change made them safer. He looked at Jaime's stump with an old bitter good humor. "You look better without the hand," he said. "Less devil, more man." "I'm finding it suits me," Jaime returned. The monks brought them bread and small beer. The bread had sand in it, and Sansa would have called it unfortunate, but Brienne ate it as if it had been a choice. I heard the she-wolf sits in a hall of stone and makes men feel like boys who've had the strap too often, Sandor said at last, and there was a curl of pleasure in his mouth that he tried to lose and failed to. Good. She sits, Brienne said. She does not use straps. She does not have to. She looked at him a long moment. And Arya runs. He spat thoughtfully into the sea. Good, he said again, barely louder than the tide. She was never mean. Tea for a chair. In the neck, the water went green again where it had been iron. Howland walked the causeways with his frog spear on his shoulder and named the plants with a tenderness that made Mira smirk because she had not been spared that education in childhood. Bran came and went, not because the Isle called him like a bell anymore, but because he had made a habit of checking on things men do not steward well when left alone. Once, by the long pool where the red leaf litter makes an autumn even in spring, he found a figure watching the water with a gaze that took it too seriously to be human. She was small and old and quick, and her eyes were gold in a way that looked like a story frayed down to thread. You did not come, she said, and the knot was a sorrow and a relief both. Her words made the air a little closer. I did not, Bran said. He felt his hand go to the carved wolf in his pocket. Rickon's rough work smooth now with being handled. I had a friend to bury and another to keep. I had a sister who needed a brother and a people who needed their own bones. She cocked her head. You killed our mistake. I gave it back its name, he answered. Her mouth, the idea of a mouth carved twice into bark, turned the faintest upward. Names, she said. Men think we gave you knives. We gave you names, and you made knives of them anyway. She did not move closer. The trees behind her felt like a room where an argument has just ended. We are fewer than a careful man's fingers, she said. Do not be greedy with our last places. I will not, Bran said, but I will come. He touched the white bark with 3 fingers and did not feel the drag on his bones. When I come, I will be myself. She tilted her head in the other direction as if listening to bees. You are better at that than some, she said. Go, boy. When your wolf's bones are old enough to be comfortable, sit. Until then, run. At the wall, the watch learned how to be useful without an enemy to point to. They repaired sluices and taught boys to dig latrines that would not poison them come spring. They trapped foxes for their fur and let half of them go for the joy at sight put in a hungry man's mouth. They brokered quarrels between free folk and the Northmen who had decided that, if land had to be shared, it could be shared with people who laughed the same way when their feet hit cold water. Tormund Giantsbane ate a pie he claimed had been made of bear and called it delicate, then told Jon he liked women with voices and bed frames that creaked like pine in winter, and went away into a blue distance with Ghost trotting at his heel, the wolf turning his head just once as if embarrassed to be sentimental. Jon stood above the new gate at Castle Black and watched a ribbon of families shuffle through, bundles on backs and children sleeping over shoulders. His breath made a cloud men pretended not to stare at. The watch's new Lord Commander was a lanky man with a laugh that shook the rafters and a patience deeper than the well in the yard, and Jon liked him because he liked other people first. When the last of the free folk had gone through and there were only tracks cut into crust and the echo of voices in the street, Jon came down and ate stew that tasted of smoke and something sweet someone had found under an old floorboard. He cleaned his bowl with a crust and felt contentment sit beside him, shy and not assured of its welcome. Sansa wrote letters in the light of an afternoon that tried to graduate itself into evening and did not quite. She wrote to White Harbor and to the Rills and to Barrowton and to Bear Island and to Torrens Square. She wrote to Wintertown, to Baker and Mason and woman with a new baby who had not received a present and thought perhaps she should. She wrote to a man in the Wolfswood who had been taking too many deer, and to a shepherd who had not been taking enough, and to a child to tell him that the picture he had drawn of a dragon was very fierce and made 3 men in the hall sit up straighter. She wrote to Jon in a hand that had learned how to stop telling him to eat and had learned how to trust that he would. She wrote to Dany words that had been hard to make once and now were only formalities wrapped around respect like crust around stew. Sometimes she reached for a ribbon to tie a letter and found she had only twine. She tied with twine and smiled because it held best. She had suitors, of course. She denied them with grace and a memory that never needed to reach for the coal tongs anymore. A boy from the Vale whose mother had taught him to think he was a coin no one else could spend wooed her with hawks and honeyed almonds and arguments about roads. She sent him home with a list of improvements for his family's granaries and a note for his mother thanking her for her good works. A man from the rills offered oxen and a willingness to bend in any wind, and she gave him a plow and told him to learn how to hold. The day 𝒂𝒊𝒔𝒊𝒐𝒏 swaggered into the yard with a song about how he would be her shield. She had him thrown out before the refrain, not because he was dangerous, but because he trivialized the things she had built. On a rough night when the new babies would not keep quiet and the old men could not keep warm no matter how many furs they piled, a woman came over the snow gate with a face that had weathered itself into nobility. She wore no rings. She wore a cloak of sealskin that had belonged to someone else first. She introduced herself simply, her name no banner but a sentence with a history in it. Asha for some, Yara now for most, Greyjoy, Lady of the Iron Islands, if such a thing can be said without contradiction. Sansa rose and embraced her, as if they had been cousins separated by a family quarrel and not islands of habit and stone. "We have bread enough," Yara said bluntly, "so long as we salt it with stubbornness and onions. This is more than any Greyjoy has had in spring in living memory. I came to say thank you for nothing you did that put us in debt. You bargained fair. You left us our misery. We have found we like it better when we chose it." Sansa laughed. "Misery makes fine company for pride," she said. "In the north we often host both. Stay. Let us see if our miseries can sit together without arguing." They sat. They ate. Yara taught the kitchen to make a fish stew that tasted of smoke and a sweetness like an apple if you were very hungry, and Sansa taught Yara to drink hot cider and not sneer, and they found that each envied the other a different strength and that this envy made them generous instead of mean. Across the narrow sea, men with long memories of queens and conquerors told each other stories that did not cross water well. Some sailed to the city with 3 hills and found a queen with bare hands and dragons, and were disappointed to discover she was neither savage nor simple. Some stayed and tried to grow crops in soil they had salted with their father's mistakes and learned how to cry without shame. Dothraki boys came to the Crownlands and discovered that winter rye laughed when you seated it like a horse that throws its head just to feel the bridle ring. Unsullied men married because men will do that once you let them, and set up barracks with cradles in them and went about being efficient with toys and wash as they were with spears. Missandei learned the names of every street in King's Landing not because she had to order men there, but because words are rooms and cities are dictionaries. She put a school in the shadow of the September and made small voices recite the rivers of Westeros the way she had once recited verbs. She called on the mothers for help and found mothers help if you ask, as if you expected them to be useful. Tyrion stood one evening in the dragon pit and listened to a dragon breathe. It was very like a bellows and very like a storm and very like nothing he had heard before. Dany came and leaned beside him on a worn arch and did not speak for a time, then said, "They will not be comfortable here for long. No one with wings would be," he said. "We will have to find them comfort elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" she repeated, as if the word were a promise to herself. She rubbed a thumb along a scratch on the stone. "I dreamed once of a chair made of swords. Now I dream of stables with roofs that won't collapse." She smiled, slight. "We have all become farmers. It's difficult to be a bad man while worrying about turnips," Tyrion said. "I have tried." "Have you?" she asked, amused. "Rarely," he admitted. He gestured vaguely north. "I did once set a large man on fire to save a city I did not love. I am trying to choose fewer dramatic solutions." "You chose me," she said. He inclined his head. "I chose you and you chose not to burn a city, which suggests you are better at choosing than I am." "Or luckier," she said. "I will take luck with both hands." In the second spring, when lambs got lost in grass for a week and the smell of damp stone went away and the smell of sweet earth came and stayed, a raven arrived from White Harbor with a letter wrapped in a fish's bladder to keep out wet, and a packet neat and leather-bound. It was from Samwell Tarly. The letter held a summary of good sense dressed in ink and ended with a confession that he had let Gilly teach 2 boys to read using a book of old songs because the songs made their mouths happy, and if mouths are happy they remember letters. The packet held a copy of a statute copied from a mold-ridden roll in the back of an Old Town shelf. A long-ago agreement between Stark and Targaryen concerning northern taxes in winters that lasted more than 3 years. Sansa took it to the table where she had taught herself to sit while others shouted, and smiled as she read. "He sent us a quiet sword," she said to Bran, who watched with eyes that always seemed to see two things at once and carry the better one to his mouth. He nodded. "Words last better than steel," he murmured. "They rust slower. No one sings about them," she said wry. "That is another quality to recommend them," he returned. He tapped the edge of the parchment. "Make it law again. Write to the queen. She will sign with both hands. She likes old promises kept." Sansa did. Dany did. Tyrion wrote 3 paragraphs on the bottom about how collection and distribution should be laid out, and then crossed them all out and wrote 1 sentence that said, "Ask the women who do the counting already and sign what they tell you to sign." The law went up in 3 septs and 2 long halls, and on the side of the baker's shop at Wintertown, because the baker's wife liked the way the letters looked, and men stopped to read while they waited for bread and remembered to tell each other what was due and what was not. In the Wolfswood, a girl with hair lighter than barley and a mouth that knew how to smile without asking permission came into camp with a pup at her heels and asked after Arya. The pup had a face like an argument and pale eyes that gave up nothing. The girl gave up a name. Nymeria, the big one, the queen of the river pack. Arya went with her because she would always go when that name was said. They found the pack in the dusk where the river lays its head under a fallen tree, a low ripple moving through the brush like fog you could touch. Nymeria came last, scarred and regal and disinterested, then sniffed Arya and blew out a breath that smelled of rabbit and far places. Arya laughed softly. "I am not coming with you," she said. "I know. I am smaller than I should be and too full of words." She put her hand out and Nymeria leaned in, tolerant. "I will go away again soon. West of west, maybe, or north of north, and see if the sky becomes a wall there too. But I wanted to see that you are as you should be." Nymeria sneezed and shook her head, bored with sentiment. She loped away, the pack boiling after her like a pot too long on a fire, and the girl with the barley hair said, "Some women leave men for wolves. Some leave wolves for men. I think you will leave both for Road." "Roads don't try to own you," Arya said. "They just ask to be traveled." She rode south afterward, not because she had changed her mind, but because the road to west begins at a dock and docks are south. She stopped at Storm's End because the new lord had sent her a note that said only come if you like, and a sketch of a hammer that looked more like a horse than any hammer should. She found Gendry in a lime-splashed shirt with a smear of charcoal on his cheek and an arm bare to the shoulder because heat had always been his friend. They went down to the shingle under the castle's bulk and threw flat stones at the surf and talked about annealing temperatures and winter turnips and whether water west of west would know a Westerosi boat. He did not ask again. She did not say she loved him, because the word would have made the air heavy, and the air was light there, off the sea. "Make me a knife," she said when they climbed back up the long stair, and her breath made her head spin. "With writing on it?" he asked, half mocking. "With no writing at all," she answered. "I will put the names on with use." He made it. She took it. It had weight without being heavy, and it balanced like a lie told by an honest man if he had to save a life. She tucked it into her boot and left at dawn without saying goodbye, because some ties are better for being tugged than tied. West, later. But first north again to say farewell to a brother who would not tell her he was leaving until she found him on the hill above the heart tree with Ghost at his heel and a bag with too few things in it at his feet. He looked as he had at 17 and as he had at 27 and as he would look until the wind had smoothed him of urgency. The scar on his cheek was a pale flag and made his smile unreliable in a way she liked. "You're going," she said. He nodded. "There's emptiness out there that calls for being filled with boot prints. You could fill it with a woman and a bed," she said, as if the words would bite less if she made them unsentimental. "I could," he agreed. "I would be poor at it. I will be better at sitting a horse and listening to a man who thinks he is asking about weather when he is asking about fear." He squinted up at the branches. "There's a roof in Wintertown that still leaks in the second room. I told them to fetch a ladder easy, and they laughed because no ladder is easy in spring with mud. I am no good at ladders in spring." She hugged him because she could. She smelled the smell that had been his since long before he had died and come back. Clean sweat and wool and a little of winter apples. "Don't be a ghost," she said into his shoulder. If you find yourself turning invisible, hit something. I will hit snowdrifts, he said, smiling. They are easier to apologize to. He held her away and looked down into her face. Bring me a shell from west of west when you find it. I'll bring you a story, she said. A shell you can drop and lose. A story sits. They parted in good humor and kept it, both of them, because they had learned the trick of carrying grief like a candle you shield with your hand so it doesn't go out and it doesn't burn you. John rode with Tormund for a bit and then without him, then with a woman and her 2 sons who had decided to see if summer beyond the wall was different from summer below it. Ghost ran and ran until the idea of stopping made him as sleepy as a child. Sansa watched them go and felt no heat of jealousy in her. She had been made for Winterfell stones and the complicated work of keeping bread moving from ovens to hands. She found joy there she had thought burned out of the world. When the first strawberries came and a girl brought her a bowl with her 2 hands bent as if praying around it, Sansa ate one and closed her eyes and years fell off her shoulders like old snow. She had willow in her hair where she had tucked a sprig and forgotten it. She would remember it later at the washing bench when it fell and laugh into her sleeve, careful not to wake the sleeping child next to the soak tub. Bran sat on the parapet with a slate balanced on his knees and drew lines the way rivers draw themselves, not echoing other men's maps but making new ones where knowledge had pooled. He drew the marsh's veins as Howland had taught him. He drew the caves in the hills east of Last Hearth where the stone broke funny and wet and old. He drew the way the wind came off the lake at the Isle and split around the tallest tree. He drew the shadows the dragons made when they passed overhead at noon. He did not draw men much. Men did not stay where he put them. Hodder came and sat at his feet with a cured leather ball in his big hands and tossed it up and caught it and said, "Ho!" After a time he said, "Door." The syllables had become tools now, not prison bars. He could say 2 other words, both names, me, the E long as a splash, R.A. and Bran. He was happiest when he could stand with a spear across his shoulders and look at a line of horizon that promised no surprises. When men came to the yard mean drunk because winter's last pinch had made them stupid, Hodder walked over to them and stood, and sometimes that was enough. Once one put a hand to him with intent and Hodder's open palm took the man's shoulders and moved him out of his own rage like a child out of the path of a cart. The man sat in the mud and cried and apologized to whoever had time to listen. At King's Landing, a boy fell from a cart under the wheels and did not die because a man reached him first. Grey Worm took the child out and wiped mud from his mouth with 2 fingers and returned him to his weeping mother saying nothing, because nothing would not make them louder. He went back to his duty with his eyes steady and the line of his jaw a little softer. Missandei watched him from the school steps and felt a happiness like a knot untying. She had not believed she would live to see a life in which sorrow was not the only thing that kept her company. She watched a girl with hair in braids trace letters onto slate and felt that if she died tomorrow her last word would be a good one. Once, when the city was warmer than it should have been for a week and men were tempted to become fools, Dany went to the dragon pit at dusk and found 2 of the 3 beasts out and looking at the sunset in the way of cats who watch a fireplace. She stood with her hand on Drogon's side and thought about leaving. Not forever. She had people now and debts and obligations that were not chains but garments she had chosen and must wear with grace. But away. The summer sea had a way of laying a hand on her and saying, "Come see." She would go, she decided, with 1 ship and 2 and with Missandei and a man who could read tides and with no banners at all. She would bring back fish no one had seen and stories that would make Tyrion's eyebrows climb. She would be a girl on a horse again, only the horse would be water. She wrote to Sansa and to Jon and to Davos and to Gendry and to Yara and to the High Septon and said simply that the Queen would be at sea for a spell, and that there would be no throne empty in her absence because a chair without a body in it is less important than a loaf without a body to eat it. Tyrion sealed the letters with an amused sigh and told the Master of Coin to put something aside for a new quay at Dragonstone because boats love gifts. On an evening that would later be praised in lemon cakes and small songs in small halls, she stood on the quay with a satchel over her shoulder and her hair in a knot that would be trouble in wind and did not care. Drogon came down and snorted at the water, offended that it dared exist in a shape that D not let him put his claws through it. She scratched his jaw and he closed his eyes and rumbled like a storm far off. "Keep the sky for me," she told him. "But don't keep it all. Leave some for the swallows." Tyrion waved once from the steps and made a joke about barnacles that made Missandei shake her head. Grey Worm did not smile, but his eyes had the glint of a man planning to keep order with quiet hands. Dany put her foot onto the boarding ladder and stopped, turned, and looked at the city and at the hills beyond and at the road that was her responsibility and the sea that was not. "Don't burn while I'm away," she said to no one and to everyone, and stepped aboard. South and west, the winds argued with each other and then agreed. The ship went out into water darker than any sapphire a king had thought worth counting. She stood at the prow and felt spray and tried to imagine a world that had never known the words her life had been made of and could not. She was content that she could not. In a village east of the Green Fork, for boys with their heads together set to work building a mill from drawings Sam had sent, and men who had once swung swords stood wrist-deep in mud and argued about angles. A woman with a scar at her throat that no one mentioned sang a song about a king who had never existed, and people cried anyway because songs are the only lies no decent person minds. A man at the quiet Isle died, and 3 monks dug in sand and laid him down with more gentleness than men often get while breathing. A sailor in Blacktide decided to give up waiting for wars and learned to ferment fish. A page in Old Town checked the oil in a lamp and found it sufficient and wrote a letter to his mother that was mostly about the weather. A farmer in the Dornish marches set out a jar of milk every morning because a snake had made a home in his wall and he had grown fond of seeing it drink. It rained. The roads drank. The grass learned again how to be green underneath. A girl at Bear Island took a knife bigger than her hand and put 3 clean holes in a pelt and sewed them with neat stitches and looked up at her mother and wanted praise and got it. A man in White Harbor made a pastry that had salmon in it and tasted indecent with hunger. A deserter from a long-forgotten company came in out of the frost with a story about bones that had walked like bad accounts and found no takers for it because men had other stories now and preferred them. In Winterfell's yard, on an afternoon that had the brass taste of storms in it and a sky with a seam torn down the middle, Howland Reed told a story to 3 children and then to Bran and then to the tree because stories want more than one kind of ear. He told of a man with a barbed spear who had stood ankle-deep in cold mud and watched an army march by him and had decided the most dangerous thing in the world is certainty. He told of a woman whose hands had never quite warmed no matter how near she stood to fire, and how those hands had pulled men from a sinking boat by their collars. He told of a pact that was not words on bark but a habit of saying please to water. He told of a boy who had said his own name, and a king who had died of memory, and of a winter that was the kind of teacher a man would not thank but would not forget. Bran listened and did not feel the urge to put his hand to bark. He remembered the taste of earth and let the taste be enough. He had a list of names in his head that was not for vengeance and not even for mourning. It was for saying on mornings when his breath made a cloud and nothing in the world seemed very interested in what he would do that day. He said one now, under his breath, a small one, human, not crowned with anything. The name he had given back to a creature long gone under the thin skin of a lake. The wind stirred then in a way that moved only the hair at his temple and not the leaves. He smiled, and it was the smile of a boy who had kept a secret with the world and found the world good at keeping. When the first apples blushed and men began to say the word harvest without spitting for luck, a messenger came to the winter town, his horse blown and his face streaked with the dust of 3 counties. He had ridden from Riverrun with a tale that had run alongside him and not lost its breath. A bandit king in the Whispering Wood, an ugly fellow with a knack for getting men to follow him out of a certain kind of despair. He had been burning carts and taking coin and selling safety by the month. The river lords had tried to pull him as you pull a weed and had lost their grip and some blood. "He calls himself 𝒂𝒊𝒔𝒊𝒒," the man said, sweating and earnest. "He says he speaks for people who were promised a new world and given the old one with fresh paint." Sansa looked to Bran, to Davos, to Tyrion where he sat now as her guest and occasional scold, then to Brienne. "I will not have a man selling fear by weight in the Riverlands and telling boys that bravery is his to rent them," she said. "We will cut him out without taking half the soil with him. Take me," Brienne said simply, "and a few men who know the look of a rope." She glanced, not meaning to, at Jaime. who sat with his hands folded like a student and looked interested in the way a man looks when his sins have had time to stop making a drum of his chest and he wants something to hit run from him. "I'll go," he said. "A tree that falls wrong once should learn to count rings." Davos cleared his throat. "And an old fool who knows how men break their own legs trying to ride pride will come too," he muttered. "This 𒒂𝒊𝒔𝒊𝒗𝒆𝒔 sounds less a king than a merchant with a talent for collecting sparks in dry seasons." They went. The river smelled of last year's leaves and this year's fish and a sweetness that might have been rot or might have been a young woman with her hair washed in something expensive, depending on your mood. 𒒂💊💔💊 turned out to be a man with a face like a bread heel and a voice that carried well. He liked to sit his horse in the road and make men with carts go into the mud to pass. Brienne rode at the front and did not move. Jaime at her shoulder smiled pleasantly and did not move either. Davos at their flank spat into the road not disrespectfully and did not move. The men behind them were not the kind who enjoy not moving, and so they enjoyed it vigorously. 𒒂💊💔💊's eyes assessed them. He did not recognize the stories standing in front of him and therefore thought it safe to treat them as furniture. "Road toll," he said. 2 coppers a wheel, 4 for an ox, and 1 for luck." "What if I don't want luck?" Davos asked, interested. "You'll get it anyway," Malloy said, amused. "Bad luck is as eager a thing as a bitch in heat. Then I will pay nothing and take my luck as it comes," Davos said, and lit like a pipe on the inside and did not show it. Malloy's men shifted. Their leader held up a hand the way men who have never truly been obeyed do. "Coins or blood?" he said, friendly as a bar knife. "Neither," Brienne said, and the word had the sound of oak splitting. "I have a letter from Lady Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell and Wardeness of the North, recognized by the Queen on the Iron Throne, acknowledging the protections owed to the Riverlands and the roads through them. You can read it if your eyes can find the letters through your hunger." "I've never met a woman who didn't bleed," Malloy said. "Give me that paper and I'll—" He did not finish because Jaime moved, quick as a thought he had not permitted himself in years, and took the man's wrist just so and turned it, and the big man who had broken boys for the weight of their purses found himself bent and staring at his horse's knees. Brienne's blade had come out without any heroics and steadied itself at his throat. Davos's old hands had taken a rope he had coiled on his saddle and made a knot look like a letter the man wouldn't be able to read even if he wanted to. "We'll not cut your head," Davos said a little sadly, "because heads are in short supply and the good Lord was not generous making more. We'll take your men and give them other things to do and send you to a place where a shovel will lodge some decency in your arms. If you run, I'll make you wish you had asked for a rope at the first. I am not a merciful man, 𒒂💊💔💊. I am only fair, and fair men in my line of work have been known to drown men for less than you've done." The thing was done by evening, quick and without a song. Brienne wrote a neat hand about it for Sansa and sent it with a boy who would not lose his way. Jaime sat on an old stump and looked at his hands, 1 hole and 1 knot, and thought of the long catalogue of stupidities he had written across his youth and felt a small lightness because that list had not lengthened that day. Davos found a girl with a baby behind a hedge and gave her a coin and told her to keep moving and not to look back. She said she had been looking back since she was 12 and he told her to stop and she nodded and he knew she would not yet. He gave her another coin. The news went out from Harrenhal and Winterfell and King's Landing, carried by men on foot and men on boats and women with baskets and boys with mouths they hadn't learned to keep shut. No more kings unless everyone agreed. No more burning unless the thing being burned had done something that could not punish. More bread than last year, fewer banners. There were brawls in taverns where men tried to decide if their grandsons would respect them without a war to boast of. There were tears in kitchens where women sat down in the middle of chopping an onion and let themselves feel something that hadn't been safe to feel for years. There were, in the end, the same bad men there had always been and the same good ones and the same gray majority and the same children licking jam off their wrists. There were dragons in the sky sometimes and sometimes not. Once, in the west, a boy threw a stone at one and the stone fell back and struck him on the shoulder and he laughed because it hurt and because no one had hit him for laughing. One evening, with the harvest done and baskets stacked, with the songs sung badly and gladly, with the last light catching the weirwood's leaves so they looked wet, Bran rolled himself along the inner wall beneath the parapet and stopped where he could look down into the yard and see without being seen. Sansa crossed the flagstones with her hair unbound, talking to the woman who had organized the baking as if the woman were her aunt. A dog limped and stole a heel of bread, and Hodder looked away to pretend he had not seen it, because a dog stealing bread is a kind of joy for a very particular sort of man. Two boys argued over a carved horse and settled it by deciding to whittle a second. Howland stood with a cup at the edge of the yard and spoke to no one and to the stones. Arya had not returned, and that was as it should be. Her places were the edges of maps, and her home was the line where ink runs out. Bran touched the carved wolf in his pocket and felt the polish Rickon's bad carving had taken from his hand, from years of being held and worried and held again. He thought of the cave he had refused and the tree that had wanted to swallow him as if he were sugar. He thought of the name he had said and how it had unmade something that had been made wrong. He thought of all the names still in the world, waiting for mouths to say them, waiting for care. He did not think of crowns. He did not think of thrones. He thought of doors. Some you hold, some you close, some you refuse. The night came down like a cloak over a friend's shoulders. The cooks bickered amiably over whether to sweeten the porridge for the morning with honey or with patience. Someone sang off-key and everyone forgave him. The air moved across Bran's face and smelled of apples and horses and wood smoke and rain waiting its turn. He breathed it and felt full. In the dark, somewhere to the south, on water that did not know her name and did not need to, a ship slid on a path no one had charted. On its deck, a queen leaned against a rail and let salt dry on her lips and felt her hair curl in the sea air and did not feel alone. She had left a city alive and would return to it alive, and between those 2 points she had only the sea to argue with, and the sea was an honest adversary. She laughed into the wind, and the wind took her laughter in and did not give it back. In the west, farther than any tale had ever troubled itself to go, a little black dot moved against a line as clean as a page. In the north, beyond long lakes that hold sky like a memory, a wolf raised its head and howled, not because it was hungry or lonely, but because its chest felt full and the moon was a good thing to speak to. In the south, a boy looked up from his book when a candle guttered and smiled because the page he had been reading had finally let him understand a joke no one else would. In the rivers, eels went on being slippery and rich and making men curse and love them. The wheels of the chair made a soft sound on the stone as Bran turned toward the doorway and the warm world beyond it. He did not try to count how many were in the hall or how many bowls or how many breaths. There are numbers that cannot be counted and do not need to be. He rolled into light, and the light bent to make room.